Today we're going to do a review of the material for the last exam, which is the big exam, and also the last argument to critically assess, which is very, very important because that's when you're going to go back to the argument you first did for the class before you knew anything about critical thinking, and you're going to re-critically assess it. And then compare the two versions, the assessment you've now done and the assessment you did several weeks ago. What's the difference between them? And it should be pretty stark because the method of loopholes is something that most students don't learn. Right. They don't learn it in grade school, they don't learn it in high school, and they don't learn it at the university because people don't teach it. But that's the only way to critically assess an argument, to tell how well the information in the premises of the argument supports the claim. That's the only way to do it. So it's important. It's an important method. And let me say something right off the bat, right now, about how you can take this method outside of the classroom and use it in the business world to sell an idea. Suppose you have some project that you are interested in pitching to a group of people who may want to buy it. The first thing you do is you think of your project as an argument and you try to find loopholes for it. And each loophole is a problem for that project. Now, when you are trying to sell this project, you have to look at the problems. Right. And you want to create a roadmap of the project. A roadmap of the project is simply an argument diagram. An argument diagram tells you how, with given premises, the initial conditions, the initial information, you go all the way through to the conclusion, to what you want to do. And a complex argument has sub-arguments, and in each sub-argument there are loopholes. Just consider the loopholes to be problems. In other words, you have a project, you lay out a roadmap when you're trying to sell this project of how you're going to go from the start to the finish. And each point in the roadmap will correspond to a sub-argument in an argument. And each loophole, the loopholes in a sub-argument, are the problems at that stage in the project. So stages in a project would correspond to sub-arguments in a complex argument diagram. So when you know how to think clearly about sub-arguments and how they fit together, right, you will also know how to think about how the stages of a project fit together. And now the loopholes are the problems you're going to encounter, and you need to talk about them. You need to say whether in fact you can address those problems. If you have so many loopholes that there's no way you could address all those problems, that tells you something about your project. It didn't work. Right. Don't even bother to go to a group of people to try to sell it. It'll be a joke. Right. Because you will see you have too many problems. But if you just have a few problems, right, 3 or 4 problems, you can easily sell the project if you talk intelligently about how to address those problems. And they are the loopholes. Right. So knowing about loopholes, how to think of them, that's to say how to come up with loopholes, is very important. But outside of the critical thinking classroom, consider a loophole simply a problem for the project, and you think, do I have enough information? That's to say, can I solve the problem? Right. Do I have the resources to tackle this problem? Which is equivalent to saying, do I have the information that I can add to my argument to get rid of the loophole, to get rid of the problem, to solve the problem.
Right.
So to say you get rid of a loophole in critical thinking is to say you've added information to your premises so that that possibility no longer arises. On the other hand, with a project, to say that you solve the problem is to say you've had the resources to address that problem. But it's the same thing. So if you know about loopholes, then you can say something intelligent about problems in business ventures, business projects that you're trying to sell. There's no chapter in the book on this. I should add a new chapter on this.
It's very interesting.
So, what's that?
It's very interesting. It applies to actual business world. Very interesting, very interesting.
So, okay, now we need to talk about the things that will show up on the last exam. And if you have any questions, just raise them. And you have one right now.
Yeah, one second argument to quickly access. The one we did the diagram.
Yeah.
And I guess a lot of people got it wrong because there were not a lot of people who I know, and I myself didn't do a good job. And like you made some comments such as you can have like three premises in the sub-argument or whatever.
Right. For the second argument,
yeah.
I made very general comments that I sent to everyone.
Right.
Not all of the comments that I made applied to all of them applied to each specific argument. But the point is, if you didn't get less than a 90, if you did get less than a 90, then what that means is that you more than likely didn't have the proper diagram. And that's the essential thing, to write out a diagram so that I can see what the sub-arguments are and how they link together. So a lot of people had diagrams in which they had something like this. That tells me nothing about what the non-basic premises are and how they link together. Now, if you had done something like this, that represents the first two sub-arguments in the in argument 2, the argument for abortion, and it identifies the sub-arguments, it identifies the non-basic premises, and I can see exactly how they link together. And the rest of the diagram should be like that as well. That's what I was looking for, because this is very important. If you are going to the business world and you're going to draw a roadmap, you want to show how all of the stages are structured. If you do it like this, people are going to laugh at you. They're going to say, I don't see any structure in here. It's not specific enough. But if you do this, it's very specific. You've given the structure and people can understand what it is. So that's what I was looking for in argument 2. That's why the first set of comments I made was look carefully for premise and conclusion indicator words. And I said every sentence except one will be in that diagram. The only sentence that won't be is a sentence that is a paraphrase of the overall conclusion, i.e. it says the same thing as the overall conclusion, and thus is the overall conclusion. The overall conclusion occurred twice in that argument. You only need to list it once in the argument diagram that you create. So that was the basic complaint I had about everyone's attempt to do argument 2, to critically assess argument 2. namely the diagram of the argument structure, needed improvement.
So it's the design, pretty much, the design.
The design, yeah.
But overall, the whole structure was fine, like, because many people, including myself, like I put, let's say, basic premise plus non-basic premise, going down to non-basic premise, going down to non-basic premise, going down to overall conclusion. Is that fine? Just non-basic premise?
Again, you needed to be more careful in how you linked those things together. That's what I was looking for, to make sure that the linkages all made sense, i.e. they gave the correct inferential structure, the correct set of inferences, the way in which the arguer went from basic premises all the way down to the conclusion.
Right.
So that's the important thing. Now, there are a couple of topics we need to talk about for the big exam that you'll be getting in a couple of days. I think it opens up on Friday or something like that.
It's what exam?
So that's the third quiz.
Third quiz.
Yeah.
What third argument quiz?
It's got 20 questions.
Oh, the third quiz, yeah, that's third.
Yeah. And they cover topics from the entire book, but you will notice when you open it up, for each question I give the chapters in the book that you need to go to in order to answer the question. Right. But I still should say something about some of those topics. One topic is deductive arguments, and that is chapter 15, Logic and Deductive Reasoning. That's on pages 229 to 259. And I will show you something in this chapter that you will be interested in. If you go to page 249, you will see a worked out analysis of an argument. And if you look carefully at the argument, you will see that it is argument 1 that you had to do as an assignment. So the answer to that first argument 1 is right here in the book on pages 249 to 252. But no one, more than likely, found that. At any rate, chapter 15 talks about a number of things. Valid argument forms. Argument forms are not arguments. They are the forms argument can take. So here's an argument form. P and Q are just variables that you can plug sentences into. And any argument you get by plugging sentences in for P and Q is a valid argument. It is impossible for you to find loopholes to that argument. And this is called modus ponens. I also talk about invalid argument forms. There is an invalid argument form. However, although any argument I get by plugging in sentences for P and Q in a valid argument form is valid. It's not true for an invalid argument form, this one, for some invalid argument forms, this one in particular, it's not true that plugging in any sentence whatsoever for P and Q will give you an invalid argument. However, it's easy to see there are invalid arguments. If you get hit by a steamroller, then you will die. You die, therefore you were hit by a steamroller. That's invalid reasoning. So that is an argument that I substitute for the P's and the Q's that is invalid. But there are other arguments I can substitute for P and Q that are valid. If the virus spreads, then it spreads quickly. The virus is spreading quickly, therefore the virus is spreading. That's a valid argument. Now, are there invalid argument forms such that any argument you get by substituting for the P's and the Q's is invalid? Yes, there are. And I call them evil twins. And here is what an evil twin is. You take a valid argument form, negate the conclusion, and the result is an evil twin. So the evil twin of modus ponens is P implies Q, P, therefore not Q. And every argument that I get by substituting sentences for P and Q is invalid. When you negate the conclusion, be careful. If the conclusion of your argument is P or Q, then this is not, suppose that you have an argument that's valid, an argument form is valid, and that's the conclusion. If you negate, if you just say not P, that's not going to give you an evil twin because all you're doing is negating P. When I say negate the conclusion, negate the entire conclusion by nodding the whole thing. So if you just nod a piece of the conclusion, that won't give you an evil twin. Yeah.
What about I saw examples where it said not PQ, not P, and then afterwards also negate the conclusion, said not Q. So not only the conclusion was negated, but also the premises were negated as well.
Don't touch the premises. It doesn't matter what the premises are, it's only the conclusion that you negate. No matter how many negations in the premises there are, you're not going to touch them to create an evil twin. If you have a valid argument form with lots of negations in the premises, leave them alone. The only place where you do anything to get an evil twin is in the conclusion. And the only thing you do is to negate the entire conclusion. Don't negate a piece of it.
Right, but again, if we let's say we just look at the argument, we're not creating anything, we're just looking at it. It says not P and Q, not P, not Q as a conclusion. Can we just, based on the fact that conclusion was negated, automatically decide that this argument is invalid?
Oh, well, sometimes,
because premises were also not
invalid. Then you can play tricks with negations. That's to say, instead of going from not P to not P, you can get the same effect by going from not P to P.
Right.
So there's no difference. But again, that's a worry we're not going to worry about because then you have to know that double negations take you back to the starting point. So when you have not P and you negate not P, you get not P, which is equivalent to P. But it's not equivalent everywhere. There are some very interesting circumstances under which not P and P are different. We're not going to worry about them, but these were well known to mathematicians who call themselves intuitionists, and they developed a whole alternative to classical mathematics in the early 19th century in the Netherlands. But we're not going to worry about that. And in intuitionistic logic, P and not P are not equivalent.
Okay.
So, but that's, you see, so there are complications which I don't want to go into.
Okay.
Life is filled with complications. We try to make things as easy as possible. The other topic you need to know about in chapter 15 is proof by contradiction. And that is a way of producing an argument that shows that your conclusion is true, which is well known in history. It goes back to the ancient Greeks, 2,500 years ago. In proof by contradiction, you add to your premises the negation of what you're trying to prove. And if you can validly infer a contradiction from that augmented set of premises, then you know all of that augmented set of premises, all of the premises in that augmented set cannot be true. Because validity is, if the premises are true, the conclusion is true. So if you validly infer a falsehood, and a contradiction is a falsehood, from a set of sentences, then you know that at least one of them must be false. Because if one of them is true, you couldn't have a valid inference.
Right.
So in a proof by contradiction, you have some argument, and suppose that you just can't figure out how it works, whether it's valid or invalid. What you do is you take your original set of premises and add to it the negation of the conclusion. That's your new set of premises. And you try to validly infer a contradiction, which is a sentence of the form A and not A, which is false no matter what. And so if this validly follows from that augmented set of premises, then there must be at least one sentence in here that's false. So if you know your premises are true in your original argument, then that must be false, therefore your conclusion must be true. Notice, in proof by contradiction, this is either valid or invalid. If it's valid, then this is false, and so at least one sentence in here must be false, and that'll be that. If it's invalid, then on the support scale from 0 to 10, in proof by contradiction, you can have nothing between 10 and 0. It's either valid or it's 0 invalid. You cannot have any situations in which your premises are true and your conclusion false. That's to say, if your argument by contradiction is invalid, then every situation must be one in which the premises are true and the conclusion false. You're not going to get any situations in which your premises are true and your conclusion true. So if you have a valid argument, if you have an invalid argument that's not 10 and not 0, suppose it's 5. What 5 means is that in half the situations in which the premises are true, the conclusion is false, and in the other half of those situations in which the premises are true, the conclusion is true. But if you have a contradiction for a conclusion, it's false in every set of situations in which the premises are true. That means it's at the 0 point on the scale. The 0 point on the scale is where the conclusion is false in every set of situations in which the premises are true. So in a proof by contradiction, the support of that argument is either 1 or 0. It cannot be anything in between. And I go into this in detail in that chapter, but it's good to be able to see it. And again, it's because of what a contradiction is. A contradiction is a sentence that is never, ever true. There are no circumstances in which a contradiction is true. Thus, there are no circumstances in which an argument with an augmented set of premises can be true and the conclusion true. In any set of circumstances in which the premises are true, the augmented set of premises are true, the conclusion is false. Now, if your argument by contradiction is valid, that means there's some set of circumstances under which this is false and these are false. But if you know P1 and P2 are true, then you know that that must be false. And thus, the conclusion is true. But if your argument is invalid, you don't learn anything about the truth of the sentence not C. And the reason why you don't learn anything about the truth of this sentence is that if this is invalid, then all you know is that there are some set of circumstances under which this is true and this false. But you don't know what those circumstances are. All you know is there's some set of circumstances under which all three are true. You can know that these are true in the actual world, but that doesn't mean you also know this is true in the actual world. When I say some set of circumstances, I mean some set of circumstances that may not be the way the actual world is. Remember, when you imagine loopholes, you are imagining situations that might not be true of the actual world. It doesn't matter, because loopholes describe situations that are left open by the information in the premises. If you knew everything about the actual world, you wouldn't need to argue. You would know all the facts there are. But you don't know all the facts there are, and that's why you're arguing. And so, if you can imagine a situation that is not ruled out by the premises of an argument in which the conclusion is false, you have a loophole. Again, that loophole might not be true of the actual world, but at your stage of inquiry into the truth about the world, you don't know what this is. You don't know that. Right. And so that's why in a proof by contradiction, if it's invalid, All that tells you is that there are some situations which may or may not correspond to the actual world, in which that's true and that's false. But you don't know what those situations are. So you can say nothing about the truth or falsity of not C. When I say you don't know what those situations are, I mean you don't know if they correspond to the way the actual world is. That's why you cannot infer anything about the truth of your conclusion when you do a proof by contradiction that is invalid. Okay, next material, very important. Necessary and sufficient conditions in chapters 17 and 18. And these are important because this vocabulary shows up throughout life. Everybody uses the vocabulary of necessary and sufficient conditions. They are used in many different ways. They are used to establish correlations between events in the actual world. They're also used to make definitions of concepts. So they play important roles in our lives. And they're very simple. I say X. Don't use, you have to bring your own erasers, markers and erasers. X is sufficient for Y provided whenever X occurs, Y occurs. So X is sufficient for Y provided whenever X occurs, Y occurs. So if X is sufficient for Y, when I have X, I have Y. To show X is not sufficient for Y, I have to show I have X and I do not have Y. Okay, for necessary, X is necessary for Y, provided whenever Y occurs, X occurs. So to show X is not necessary for Y, show you have Y and you do not have X. So to show X is not sufficient for Y, show you have X and you do not have Y. To show X is not necessary for Y, show you have Y and you do not have X. At any rate, the standard examples, and I use these in the book, are fuel and fire. So, is fuel sufficient for fire? No. I can show you fuel without fire, like an electric lighter. However, is fire sufficient for fuel? Yes, fire is sufficient for fuel because whenever I have fire, I have fuel. Notice that necessary and sufficient conditions are the flip side of one another. If X is necessary for Y, if X is sufficient for Y, then Y is necessary for X. So, if fire is sufficient for fuel, then fuel is necessary for fire. You will never find a fire without fuel. So if X is sufficient for Y, then Y is necessary for X. That follows from those definitions. Now, causal relations. These necessary and sufficient relations are called correlations. If X is sufficient for Y, or if X is necessary for Y, then X and Y are correlated. However, correlation is not causation. It doesn't mean when X and Y are correlated that X causes Y or that Y causes X. Why is that? When all you know is that X is correlated with Y, that leaves open 4 possibilities. 1, X and Y may not have any causal relations between them. 2, X might cause Y. 3, Y might cause X. 4, there might be an independent cause Z which causes both X and Y. All of those 4 possibilities are compatible with knowing simply that X and Y are correlated. The point of scientific experiments is to acquire information to rule out the possibilities and establish one of the 4, mainly a causal relationship. If X is causally sufficient for Y, can Y be causally necessary for X? No, because causation runs in only one direction. If X causes Y, Y cannot cause X. On the other hand, if X is sufficient for Y, then Y is necessary for X. So if X is causally sufficient for Y, then Y is necessary for X, but not causally necessary, because Y cannot cause X.
So once again, double check. If X is causally sufficient for Y, then Y is necessary for X.
Yeah, and that's it.
That's what I thought. Okay.
Okay, so these are important. And you find in the book various uses. For instance, any hierarchy, any graph structure whoops, got to use the right ones. Suppose that's a hierarchy, call it the animal kingdom, where animal vertebrate, invertebrate. Okay, we can talk about nodes in this hierarchy, relations between nodes in terms of necessary and sufficient. If you are an animal, are you a vertebrate? Is being an animal sufficient for being a vertebrate? No, because you could be either a vertebrate or an invertebrate. So being an animal is not sufficient for being a vertebrate. Is it necessary? Yes. Being an animal is necessary for being a vertebrate, because wherever I have a vertebrate, I have an animal. So necessary runs down. Any higher node is necessary for any lower node, and sufficiency runs up. Any lower node is sufficient for any higher node. Being a vertebrate is sufficient for being an animal, because wherever you have a vertebrate, you have an animal. So sufficiency runs up in a hierarchy or a graph structure, and necessary runs down. Finally, there's only one book in the world in which this is covered. These definitions of necessary and sufficient have some odd consequences. There are very strange processes in our world that conform to necessary and sufficient. When our ancestors in medieval times had strange beliefs, as do people today have some strange beliefs. Our ancestors in medieval times thought that sunspots caused plagues, i.e., there is a correlation between sunspots and plagues. We say there could not be a correlation between sunspots and plagues. That's foolish. However, sunspots always occur. There's never a time when there's not a sunspot on the surface of the sun. Thus, plagues are sufficient for sunspots, because you will never find plagues without sunspots. And if plagues are sufficient for sunspots, then sunspots are necessary for plagues. And thus, our ancestors in medieval times were right. There is a correlation. And that's the problem with these definitions. They open up crazy correlations. And what I do in the book is try to find a way to rule out such correlations. So, think about sufficiency. If Y always occurs, then any X whatsoever is sufficient for it. Similarly, think of things that do not occur. If X never occurs, then it is sufficient for any Y, because you'll never find a case where you have X and don't have Y. Flying pigs do not occur. Thus, flying pigs are sufficient for you getting 100 on this exam, because there'll never be a time when there are flying pigs and you don't get 100, since there are no flying pigs. So we want to rule that out. And what I say is the following. I define new set of conditions, pseudo-necessary and pseudo-sufficient. If X never occurs or Y always occurs, then X is pseudo-sufficient for Y. And it's the opposite for necessary. If X always occurs or Y never occurs, then X is pseudo-necessary for Y. And as far as I know, this is the only book in the world that does this. But it's an important thing to do, because there are some situations which we would not want to say are genuine correlations. So we have to distinguish the authentic necessary and sufficient conditions from the pseudo-necessary and pseudo-sufficient conditions. So this is important. This will also possibly appear on quiz 3.
Right.
Last but not least, there are on quiz 3 several fallacy questions. And this is the material in chapters 23 and 24, the material on fallacies of reasoning. From ancient times, people categorized ways of reasoning that are fallacious, which is to say, When the premises of fallacious arguments are true, the conclusion is typically false. Not all fallacies are fallacious. One fallacy of reasoning is called begging the question, and it is always valid. Begging the question is where you assume the truth of your premise in establishing your conclusion, because your conclusion is just a paraphrase of the premise. So, a famous example of that was sleeping potions. And sleeping potions cause you to fall asleep. Another way of putting it is they have a dormitive effect. So, sleeping potions cause you to fall asleep. Premise, conclusion, they have the dormitive effect. That's begging the question, because the conclusion just is a paraphrase of the premise. And that's always valid reasoning. Since the conclusion is a paraphrase of the premise, whenever the premise is true, the conclusion is true, and thus the reasoning is valid. But it's called begging the question because if your question is whether the conclusion is true, then arguing it by begging the question won't establish it's true, since you don't know whether the premise is true, because you don't know whether the conclusion is true. The conclusion just is the premise. So I cover in 2 chapters different kinds of fallacies. Some fallacies are kind of social fallacies. They involve interactions with people. One such fallacy is called the fallacy of majority opinion. Most people believe that P is true, therefore P is true. There's also a fallacy called the ad hominem, where you assume what someone says is false because that person is unpleasant to you in some way. So, Jack says P. Jack always has an unpleasant odor, therefore P is false. That is called an ad hominem argument. At any rate, there are also arguments in chapter 23 the appeals to emotion and arguments from ignorance and fallacies of feeling. You should read the examples carefully. Fallacies of feeling are typically where you have no information whatsoever about some situation, but you say, I just feel it's true, therefore it's true. The current President of the United States engages in such fallacies all the time. My intuitions tell me this must be so. I'm not going to listen to the experts. I'm not going to listen to the people who make their living thinking about political matters and strategies. I'm just going by my intuitions, my feelings. Anyway, that's fallacious reasoning. If all you go on are your feelings, you're reasoning fallaciously. Because your feelings don't have any connection to the world, other than what your experience has taught you. And it may not have taught you the right things. You need extra information besides your feelings to make a rational judgment. So don't just trust your feelings. Even if you're convinced something is true, check it out. Get the additional information. Yeah.
When talking about fallacy of feeling, let's say there's an argument which says, let's say I 100% truly believe that this desk is black, right? I mean, it says that all workers' desks are black, right? Therefore, all workers' desks are black for me. Is that fallacy?
Well, again, we don't make conclusions in the form, something is true for me. We say something is true for everyone.
Right.
If we made conclusions in the form, something is true for me, then everything would be true, because it would be true for me.
Right.
And we'd get nowhere. This is called relativism about truth, and it's a very insidious doctrine. And we have to be careful not to fall into it. When we make claims about the truth of something, we make claims about the truth as something is for everyone, and not just for me. Otherwise, we'll go nowhere. If I say it's true for me, but not true for you, that's meaningless. And that's another problem with the current occupant of the White House. Okay. Arguments for ignorance are where you don't know how much evidence there is. And you assume not finding evidence tells you something must be false. But that is fallacious reasoning. In chapter 24, there's a set of fallacies of composition and division. The invariance fallacy. That's actually my own fallacy. I'm sure that something like this is in the literature, but I made it up. That's to say, I dubbed it a fallacy. Sorry, I shouldn't say I made it up. I called that kind of reasoning fallacious reasoning. It is reasoning where you assume things remain the same over time. So if there's a certain thing that's true at time 1, it doesn't mean it's true at time 2. Right. Otherwise, the world would remain the same. The world is constantly changing. So it's a very dangerous fallacy to engage in. But people do it all the time. When you cross the street, never ever engage in this reasoning. It was true at time t0 that it was safe to cross the street. I closed my eyes for 5 seconds. It's now safe to cross the street at time t+5. That's very dangerous. False dilemma is where you fail to take into account alternatives. So you say it's either A or B, but in fact there might be more alternatives than A and B. It might be there's A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Non sequitur and red herring. Non sequiturs are where your conclusion has almost no relation to your premises. These are very bad pieces of reasoning. Red herrings are different. Red herrings look like you're saying something very important, but in fact, your premise has nothing really to do with what you're trying to claim. So the example in the book is of a red herring where the father says to the son, "You're a reckless driver, therefore you cannot have a car." The son says in response, "You know a lot of people in high positions. If I get into trouble, I'll never go to jail. I'll be off the hook, so it's okay for me to have a car." That might be true, that the father can get the son off the hook. But it does nothing whatsoever to diminish the argument that the son is reckless, therefore he should not drive. Straw man fallacy is where you attribute to somebody something they never said or do not believe. A current example is the President of the United States said that the Democrats created a bill which separated immigrant parents from their children. That's a complete falsehood. The Democrats never, ever established such a bill. And in fact, there is no such federal bill that does that. That's straw man. He's saying of the Democrats they did something or believe something that they in fact did not do and do not believe. There are also several important fallacies of language use called fallacies of vagueness and fallacies of equivocation. Vagueness is where you use language that is vague to establish a conclusion. Advertising is loaded with such fallacies. Equivocation is where you use a word with multiple meanings and use the word differently throughout the argument. You use it to mean one thing at one place in the argument and another thing at another place in the argument. That is a fallacy of equivocation. There's also a fallacy of slippery slope, which is very important to know about. And I'll caution you about fallacies of slippery slope. They're well known. For instance, people say, who are anti-abortion, that a fetus has consciousness. And the way this is argued is, you have consciousness at time t1. You're almost similar to the way you were at time t0. Therefore, at time t0, you have consciousness. And you keep going down. That's fallacious reasoning, because there may be some point at which you fail to have consciousness. Consciousness may arise in a fetus at some point in its development, but it may not be there from when you simply have a fertilized zygote. At time, at the very beginning, where the egg is, sperm fertilizes the egg, there may not be any consciousness at that point.
Right.
However, just because the conclusion in a slippery slope doesn't follow from the premises, don't think the negation of the conclusion must be true. So that is an important thing to think about when you are confronted with a slippery slope argument. The reasoning in a slippery slope is fallacious. But just because it's fallacious doesn't mean the negation of the conclusion is true. All it means is that this way of reasoning for the conclusion won't work. Nothing more. And for any fallacy, that's something you should keep in mind. All it means is that way of arguing for the conclusion is not good. It doesn't show you the conclusion is false. Yeah.
So I apologize. I will have to leave within 10 minutes.
Okay. Yeah. Well, we're going to wrap this up very soon.
Let me make sure I get all the information.
Yeah. So if you have some questions, please raise them.
Actually, all the questions have been answered. You already answered.
Okay. That's good. That's good. If anyone has any questions when they're doing quiz 3, email me. I may or may not be able to answer them. Some questions you can't give any information without giving away the answer. But if it's a question where I can give you information without giving away the answer, then I will. Also, work hard on argument 3, because that's very important. And finally, your portfolio. All of the things in the units, double check that you have everything that has to go into the portfolio. And do not forget, submit the portfolio as one Word file. Do not separate your portfolio into N pieces.
Right.
Okay, so that's it.
Awesome.